In this recording, we're going to focus on advanced cost variances, and we're going to look at Autumn 19 question 1, where cost variances came up for 8 and 6 is 14, 14, 5, 19, 28 marks out of 38. So it's nearly half your question 1 was just on variances. The question part D was calculate the labour mix and labour yield variance. So unlike other exam questions here, they went straight into the advanced variances. They didn't ask you labour rate, labour efficiency cap 1, but we're going to do those for completeness so we can start to see the links between cap 1 and cap 2. But in this case, you weren't required to do it. You go straight into the mix and yield variances. Then they ask you 6 marks, which is nearly as much as the calculations. Explain based on your results here 3 potential ways they could improve the efficiency of the labour use. Then you're asked to calculate planning and operating variances only for one type of labour. So don't read the question carefully. 5 marks, and then another 9 marks with 3 possible issues before they should adopt a more technological approach to furniture production. So what you can see here is 8 and 5 is 13 marks for calculations, but there's 15 marks for narrative. Right, so that's important that you understand here is calculations are key, of course, to SFMA, but narrative is important as well. And that's where students typically lose marks, is they can't apply their knowledge to the narrative. So I'm assuming you've read the question. We'll just briefly look through it. So Benton's PLC is a furniture manufacturer. It's listed on the AIM or the ESM market in Ireland, or the AIM if you're in the Northern Ireland. And essentially they're involved in the design and manufacture of furniture, and they have a good reputation. Now, what you will see in the case studies, you'll always have the background. These couple of ones are to do with the financing sections, and then the examiner will use strategically headings to help you along. So the labour efficiency is getting at the labour variances, or that part D, E, F, and G. So what you're told here, they have a review of the company's labour efficiency, and they're thinking about moving to changing their production methods to move to more technology or automation based. And there's a bit of apprehension of whether, because they're currently very much labour intensive manufacturing by hand. So what essentially they're trying to figure out is the performance using variances of a kitchen table called Dine. And then you're also told about a change in standard during the year about what the grade 1 labour should have been due to a new standard being agreed, but it wasn't implemented. So it's important that you take your time. I've only quickly gone through it because I'm assuming you've read through this beforehand, but it gives you a good overview of the context here. They're a heavily labour intensive manufacturing process currently, and they're thinking about going to automation. And we have to look at the numbers around the variances, and then we've also to look at the narrative around what other things should they consider. And the examiner then guides you towards Appendix 2. So in Appendix 2 then, you can see here, you're given the budgeted information, the amount of hours, and the cost per hour. And then you have the actual information and the actual cost per hour. So don't mix those two tables up. And they manufactured 5,000 units during the year. Now remember, the question asks you to go straight into labour mix and labour yield, but I'm actually going to start, just for tutorial purposes, we're going to start with labour rate and labour efficiency. 1, 2, and 3. So the different types of grades. And we're just doing this for completeness to show you the links between them, and it's good practice because there's no such thing as a one standard variance question. The examiner can shape it and change it each year, asking the same things but in slightly different ways. So the way I do a labour rate variance, which is a cap 1 variance, I do actual hours, actual rate, actual hours, standard rate, standard hours, standard rate. And you compare them across to get your rate variance, and we'll also get here the efficiency variance. So we're going to look at both them together. I kind of do a 3-column approach. So the first one is actual hours, actual rate for 1. Well, 1 you're using 8750 times 2850, which is 249375. Again, you may have a different way of doing it, that's fine. As long as you get the same answer, you'll get your full marks. It wasn't asked here, but we're just doing it for completeness. Actual hours, 8750 times the standard rate. Standard rate was only 2575. Don't worry about changes in the rates yet. We'll deal with that when we get to planning and operating. The initial variances are always based on the existing standards. So I always leave everything as positive, and what I look at here is Well, that means I paid more per hour than expected. So this is going to be an adverse rate variance. And the variance there, adverse, is 24, and that's technically, if you want to be accurate, 062.5. So that is your rate variance, and it is adverse, just to show that you know they're positive or negative. That's your first one done. Your standard hours, be careful now, it's the 5,000 units times expected quantity per hour, 2,000. That will be 10,000 standard hours to make 5,000 units. There's no difference between budget and actual production here. Sometimes in other questions they make it a bit more complex and said the budget might have been 4.5, but the actual output is 5,000. You always use the actual output times the standard hours. And this will be times 25.75. Again, just double check before you do the numbers. I've used less hours than budget. This is going to be a favorable variance. And the difference there, I always leave it as positive. 32,188, so it's technically 187.5 if you want to be exact. That's favorable, and that's your efficiency variance. So not a lot of work. Probably half the questions will ask you for the Cap 1 variances, half of them won't. But it's no harm to be able to do them as a memory aid, and you should have a cheat sheet giving you step by step how you get each of the Cap 1 variances, because they do still appear in the final exam. Same approach then for grade 2. Grade 2 is 17.5 times 14.25. 17.5 times 14.25 just happens to come to the same number. That's a coincidence. Then you're going 17.5 times the standard rate per hour for grade 2 was 15. So again, double check. The standard rate per hour is bigger than the actual, so that means you saved money here. You paid 75 cents per hour less than expected, so that will be favorable. And that will be the rate variance for grade 2. A favorable rate variance overall. And we replicate that then. The standard hours for grade 2 labor was 3 hours per unit for grade 2, and you made 5,000 units, so 15,000 times 5, or 15. So that means here we use 2,500 hours more than expected. This will be an adverse variance. You are less efficient with your labor hours efficiency, and that is adverse, 37.5. So again, usually even when these come up, there's not too many marks because they're quite straightforward. It's just getting the right information in the right format, and that's why I like this 3-column approach. It's very clear to you for studying, and it's also very clear to the examiner where it's coming from. And finally then, for grade 3, 27.5 times 11.10, which is 305.250, and the standard rate per hour was 10.25. So that is 27.5 times 10.25. And just double check your logic. You expected to pay 10.25, the standard rate. You actually paid 11.10. So that's going to be an adverse rate variance. You paid more than you expected, and that is a rate variance. 23,375. The standard hours, which will be 5,000 units times 5 hours, which is 25,000 times the standard rate, 10.25. So again, double check. You should have used 25,000 hours to make 5,000 units. You actually used 27,500 hours. So that means you are less efficient in grade 3 labor. So that's adverse, and that's your efficiency. So when you're doing the rate and efficiency, you will always do them individually. So the overall rate there, just be careful which one you start with, adverse plus the other adverse, net the favorable, gets you to 34,312.5, and that is adverse overall rate. You weren't asked for it, but that's how you get it if you were. The overall efficiency, you add up the efficiency to adverse and you take off the favorable. Just be careful how you net them to make sure you're doing it the right way. and that will get you an adverse variance of 30,938 or 937.5 overall efficiency. But that should be bread and butter from your study from your interim assessments for January as well.
So you should now know from your advanced cost variances cheat sheets that this overall labour efficiency can now be split into labour mix, and it can also be split into labour yield. Right, so again, this is important. These are the more advanced ones, and these are the ones you are asked for when you're looking at your question in the requirements. This is the labour mix and yield. So they wanted you to start here rather than doing the cap 1 variances out, but it's no harm to be able to do the cap 1 variances, as we said, for completeness. So labour mix, labour yield. And what we're going to do is a tabular format for both of these. So I'll show you the labour mix first, but again, try and tackle it yourself. The labour mix table, where you look at AQAM, AQSM, the difference in hours, the adverse or favourable variance, the standard rate, and that gets you a euro variance. So the key point is here is about practice. The labour mix table is very similar to the sales mix table, is very similar to the materials mix table. And we have 3 grades here, 1, 2, and 3. Now, the first key thing is AQAM is just the actuals. What's the actual amount of each of the hours used? And you get that from the appendix. That will be, in this case, 8750, 17.5, and 27.5. So total hours worked 53,750. And that is coming from here, actual quantity of hours used. The AQSM still takes the 53,750, because remember, you're still taking AQ, but what you want to figure out now is what is SM? We want to know, where did we get the standard mix from? That's what SM stands for. We want to know, what was the expected mix of 1, 2, and 3? And how you get that is, you look at here, 2, 3, and 5 per unit. 2, 3, and 5 means there was expected to be 10 hours used per unit overall. 20% were expected to be grade 1, 30% were expected to be grade 2, and 50% were expected to be grade 3. That's what we call our SM. There's always a small bit of work to get that, but it's the same in the sales mix, it's the same in material mix. So what AQSM is you take the actual quantity which you have and you apply the standard mix. So you should have worked 20% of all hours should have been grade 1. It clearly wasn't. You worked less than that, 2,000 hours less, which would have been favourable. So standard mix is bigger than actual mix. Less is good here for a cost perspective. You should have worked 30% of all hours to be grade 2. It should be 3. And you worked more than that. So this is going to be 1375 adverse. And half of all the hours worked should have been grade 3, which is 26,875, but you worked 27.5. So that's adverse as well. So that's the first key thing is AQAM is always the actuals. AQSM is take the same total. So there's no difference in the totals, but there is a difference in the split. And one rule of thumb when you're labeling them here is the differences are not, there's no difference here. The totals are not different. So when you net them off, you have 2,000 adverse, 2,000 favourable. So what that means is you've worked 2,000 less hours of grade labour 1, which per hour cost, if we go back and look at the thing, standard per hour cost is 25.75. Just make sure that's coming out. And you've substituted in, you've worked 2,000 more hours together of 2 and 3. Grade label 2 is 15 an hour. Grade label 3, 10.25. So sort of substituting them around. And then you multiply the hours difference by the rate, and that gets your variance down along. So just make sure we have those to 2 decimals just to keep it clean. You don't necessarily have to go to 2 decimals, but just to make everything tot up, we'll follow that. If it's favourable in hours, it's favourable in money, and adverse is adverse. So net them off, that comes to a net favourable variance of 24468.75 favourable. And we call that the labour mix variance. So that's important. It's very similar structure to what you've done with sales mix ones before. So what are we saying happening here? The first thing, the reason there's a mix variance is you haven't worked 20%, 30%, 50%. You've worked more of grade 3, more of grade 2, and less of grade 1. The reason it's favourable is you're using less of the most expensive labour, which is the most skilled labour you assume, and you're using more of the cheaper labour. So what you're doing is you're substituting out expensive labour, substituting in cheaper labour. Now we might see, will there be a link there between the mix yield or the labour mix variance and the yield variance? Because if you're using more unskilled labour, you might be saving money here, but you might be losing money in the ability of those workers to be as efficient in terms of yielding output. So if we come back up, we now know our mix is, just tidy it up, 24,468, and that's favourable. So you can actually back into what the labour yield must be. The labour yield must be 24,468.75 plus 30,937.5 adverse. Because both of these added together must get an overall adverse of 30,937.5. So you can kind of back into what you know the answer will be, and we'll prove it using our tabular format. So there's a lot of repetition in these variance questions, but it is about practice. The more the questions you practice, the more comfortable you become. So we'll set up then our labour yield. You have 1, 2, and 3 as before. Across the top, you will now have AQSM. You've done this already, don't reinvent the wheel. SQSM, the difference in hours, the label, the standard rate, and the euro variance. So there's a lot of similarities, and that's why I'm a big fan of telling students use the tabular method when possible. This particular column is already in the other table. Don't reinvent the wheel. You have it here, AQSM, just bring it down. And there's your 53,750. The standard quantity, be careful here, that's coming from the question. Your standard quantity would have been 5,000 units at 2 hours, which is 10,000. 5,000 at 3 hours, which is 15,000. And 5,000 at 5 hours, which is 25,000. So you should, based on standard, have used 50,000 hours. You actually use 53,750. So clearly the yield is less than expected. You're being less efficient. And those 10, 15, and 25 are the figures we've used already. Standard hours 10, standard hours 15, standard hours 25. So there is a benefit often while the examiner will ask you cap 1. Not always, but sometimes they do. So we work across then. That's 750 adverse, 1125 adverse, and this is 1875 adverse. They're all adverse because all your actual hours are bigger than your standard. And the rule of thumb will be the difference here. You've worked 3,750 hours more than expected. So then when you label your variances, they should sum up to the difference, which is 3,750. So use those as rules of thumb. There should never be any difference when you're looking at mix because you're looking at the same quantity. Whereas when you're looking at yield, you're looking at AQ compared to SQ. And then you just copy down the same standard rates as you had in the previous table. And you get your monetary answer. 750 times 2575. And I'll just make sure that these are all to 2 decimals, just for completeness. That'll be adverse. 1125 hours adverse times 15 an hour. And 1875 adverse times 1025. All adverse. And thankfully, that is the answer we're looking for. The labour yield. So that labour yield, 55,406.25, plus the labour mix, gets me to the overall labour efficiency. So we know that's the relationship that holds, and you've learned that with your advanced cost variances. So what are you seeing if you're trying to interpret it is, you've saved money by using less expensive labour. You're using more of grade 2 and 3, which are cheaper. You're using less of grade 1. What that is translating into is less yield. You're using more hours across the board, most likely because the workers you have are less efficient. They're not as good at turning labour hours into finished goods, which is why it's called the yield. You're not yielding enough finished goods for the labour hours you're putting in. So they're the types of things that you would expect to be bringing up in the exam question. So use your tabular approach if you want to, and some students may like that method. There is the total method if you want to use it instead. Total actual hours, total budget hours. The actual hours, 53,750. Total budgeted hours were 50. That's 3,750 hours adverse. So if you're just looking at the total method, you don't look at individually, but it should still get you the same answer. This is the total hours, and what you need to get in is a weighted average cost per hour, because you need one single figure to monetize it by, and you get that by multiplying one's cost per hour times 20, because if you remember, that's the weighting we gave to grade 1. 15's hour times 30%, because they are €15 an hour and they are a weight of 30%, and then 10.25 times 50%. So that's why I'm not a big fan of the total method always. It's not as intuitive. The tabular method is much more suitable because you already have the tabular method for mix. There's no alternative to that one. So if we work that out, the weighted average cost per hour will be about 15. If we just go back to 2 decimals, 14.78. And when you multiply that by the number of hours overall, there's your 55,406, which is the same as the 55,406. So the total method is completely valid. If you get it right, you get full marks. But if you make a mess of it, you may lose a lot of marks because it's not clear where you're getting your figures from. There's much more scope to get marks or workings here, and it's probably much more intuitive as well. So just double check which one you're happy with. You don't have to be able to do both. Do one or the other are fine as well. So that was our answer to the first part D of Autumn 19. Mix and yield. 8 marks, you had about 16 minutes. But I said we spent a small bit longer because we did the Cap 1 variances as well. Part E then, for nearly as much marks, explain based on your results to Part D 3 potential ways that Bentons could improve the efficiency of labour. So you have to, again, this key thing, link it back to Part D and give 3 potential ways. So 3 by 2 marks. You have about 12 minutes to answer something like this, but you might even spend a bit less because you might want a bit longer in some of the calculations. So if you consider, the question is, how can they improve the efficiency? Well, one of the first things we noted when we looked at the solution was you changed your mix. By using more of the cheaper labour, which we assume is less skilled, that could contributing towards the poorer efficiency. So one suggestion could be, well, alter your mix back to the standard mix. That's one obvious one. Second one, which is not a common answer to put, check your standards. Are the standards for the efficiencies correct? Are the standard hours here in terms of 2 hours, 3 hours, and 5 hours, are they the correct ones, or do they need to be updated? So change your mix back to the standard mix. Do you need to update your standards? Does the staff need extra training? So you could do an audit of the training requirements, etc. And a fourth one, if you wanted to put in one, is link it back to the question. You're told in the question they're thinking about automation. Automation could very well improve the efficiency because you remove the human element to it. And if it's to a certain standard, you can reduce the whole idea of downtime, anything like that, and it could be a lot more efficient. So just trying to think outside the box. That's where students typically do poorly, often do very well in the calculative element, but when it comes, you think of the examiner feedback in some of these, you might only get 3 out of 6 marks. So you're throwing away very valuable points there. All we're expecting is 3 bullet points, maybe 1 or 2 sentences each. Nothing more than that. So we go on then to the second calculative element in this, which is asking you for the variances related to grade 1 labour. They want the rate variance, the planning rate variance, and the operating rate variance. So this is quite a niche one. Sometimes they'll ask you to do labour rate and efficiency, and we'll do both just for the sake of it, but they just ask you for rate here. So essentially asking for half the work. We have the rate and efficiency variance done for grade 1 already. We're kind of ahead of ourselves. If we come up to grade 1, we have the rate and efficiency complete. So they are only asking you for the rate. So they just wanted this figure here, the 24, but we have both them complete. So we're going to use this now. So just clear out some of this. And we're going to do planning and operating because one of the standards has changed during the year, and we want to figure out how is that going to impact how we interpret our variances. So if you go back to the question, and we go and we see the text, the last line of this text here, the last paragraph, it said, Joe has also been informed that due to a promise made by Tim at a social event, the standard price per hour for grade 1 should have been 26.8, but it wasn't included in the budget, but it was agreed. So essentially they're going to take strike action unless the 26.8 was to be the budgeted standard labour hour from the beginning of 2018. So if we go back to note 9, this standard is incorrect. The standard that you have in and you've calculated your variances on, 25.75, that's the original standard. The updated standard should be, as per page 3, or page 2 should I say, it should be 26.8. So you're going to have to recalculate the variances to calculate planning and operating variances. Now there's 3 steps always in planning and operating. Step 1 is list out the information. List out info. So what you have here, you have 3 pieces of information. You have the actual, you have the revised standards, and you have the originals. Now remember, in the question they only asked you to do half of it. They only want the labour rate planning and the labour rate efficiency, or operational. They don't want the labour efficiency ones, but we'll just do them for the sake of completeness. So the actuals here for hours, and the actual for the rates. So the actual hours, if we go back to the question on page 9, and we look down, the actual hours, 8750. We're only doing grade 1, remember. We're not looking at grade 2 or 3. And the actual rate was 28.5. I'll just keep those to 1 decimal. The original standard was 5,000 times 2, 10,000. And the original rate, 25.75. And your revised, now your revised hours doesn't change. Sometimes it does in questions. This time they only moved 1. It was only the rate that updated. And then you have here 26.8. So this, the first thing, is listed out. When we're doing planning and operating variances, what we're trying to do is isolate what part of the variance is due to manager performance. And that is comparing these two. So comparing these two, actual and revised, gets your operating variances. Comparing these two, if I put these in a bit of an orange, comparing revised to original, that will get you the portion of the variances that's due to planning. They are nothing to do with managerial performance, they're to do with a change in standard. And that's why planning and operating are quite important, is they give you more information. Your step 2 is compare actual to revised. And that will get your operating variances. Right. So all you do is your 3-column approach. Don't try and make complicated formula. Just do here actual hours, actual rate, actual hours, be careful, revised rate, revised hours, revised rate. So nothing more than that. You don't have to worry about complex formula, ex post or ante post you'll see in some solutions. Just treat it as the cap 1 question. Actual hours, actual rate, 8750 times 28.5. actual hours revised rate 8750 times 26.8. So their benchmark should have been 26.8. They still missed that, so it's going to be adverse. And it's going to be adverse to the tune of 14,875. 14,875. And we call that the operating rate variance. That's what you call that, the operating rate variance. If you bring that out, just to make sure there's no decimal, 14,875. And here then, your revised hours were still 10,000, they weren't changed. Revised rate, 26.8. So what we're saying then is, should have used 10,000 hours, actually only used 8750. This is going to be favorable. And this is going to be 33.5, your operating efficiency variance. Now you weren't asked for that, but I'm going to do it anyway, because I'm going to do a little exercise at the end to show you how they all link together. So it's good completeness just to go above and beyond that, just to make use of this support session. Right. So we're saying here you paid more than expected, but you used a lot less than expected. And they are the variances that should be used for managerial performance. The other variances in step 3 is you compare revised to original. And that will get your planning variances. So that is revised hours, revised rate, revised hours, standard rate, standard hours, standard rate. Again, don't make it too complex. Just do your 3 columns out so you understand what you're looking for. This is done already, so we can just copy it down. Revised hours, revised rate is the same as above. Revised hours, 10,000 times your standard rate was 25.75. So what we're saying here then is the standard rate was 25.75. The updated rate, which was agreed at the social event, was 26. So this is an adverse movement. It's an adverse planning movement, 10.5. And that is the planning rate variance. And that is adverse. So that's nothing to do with the manager. That's due to the fact that the standard that's expected has increased. Standard hours, standard rate, 10,000 times 25.75. So it's actually the same. And that is nil. And that is what we call the planning efficiency variance. And that should make sense to you. Why is it nil? Because actually the hourly rate standard didn't change. The only thing that changed from a standard perspective was the amount of pay. Your expectation of how many hours per unit still remains the same. So there's no planning change there because it didn't alter. That's why it's nil. And that is your answer then. What was asked in the question was, in page 3, was the labour rate planning, labour rate operational, and that is those 2 figures. Labour rate planning, labour rate operational. What you can, if you wanted to, you can put in those, but you won't get marks for them. But often people will do it anyway because that's the way they've learned. So it's no harm to understand the broader one, but they only asked you for half of them there. But in other exam questions that you'll see, they'll ask you for the full amount. What's always a useful exercise at the end of these is compare the CAP 1 variances, the rate and the efficiency, to the CAP 2 variances, which is rate planning, rate operational, efficiency planning, and efficiency operational. And we just want to show the relationship between CAP 1 and CAP 2. So the CAP 1 rate and efficiency, if we go back up, 24062.5, and that was favourable. Just make sure that they're all to 1 decimal. 2. And the efficiency was 32187.5. And that was favourable. So that was adverse, that was favourable. So your net variance there was a favourable variance of 812.5. Your rate planning was 10.5 adverse. Your rate operational was 14,850. 14,875 adverse. Your efficiency planning was nil, and your efficiency operational was 33,500 favorable. So when you add those up, net off the two adverse, the key insight is it's the same answer. All you're doing is splitting them differently. And that's an important insight if you're asked to make decent commentary or just understanding. We're still comparing actual to original. All we're doing in planning and operating variances is splitting them out further. We want to know what portion of the variances are to do with managerial performance, what portion are to do with a change in standard. And you can see here, if we are looking, for example, at the rate, we're saying, God, you're very poor in a Cap 1 variance, you're 24 off. Actually, some of that is because the standard changed. There was an acceptance that, for example, the planning, that the 25.75 was going to 26.8. So that planning shouldn't be attributable to the manager. That's outside their control. What should be attributable to the manager is, how did you go from 26.8 up to the actual cost of labour grade 1, when we look at page 9, of 28.50. So that's the big concern, the 28.5. That's what should be in the eyes of the manager. So this understates how the performance was. It was actually a bit better than that because there was a movement. The efficiency, it doesn't really change. There's a small issue, but the key point is there was no planning change. So that's all attributable to the manager's performance. You used more hours than expected. What some students think is when you add the two rates together, they won't exactly equal the rate here. And when you add the two efficiencies together, they won't exactly. Now, they will be close, but it's only the overall totals that will be the same. Just so you get an idea if you're on the right track. And it can be a nice sense check in some questions, because you may have this already calculated in part A, and you can sense check whether your planning and operating variances make sense in part B as well. But that was an important one, so you understood why planning and operating are important. Right. So you can then have a look yourself at the last part. It's quite an easy enough one. The last part, which is for 9 marks, advised Joe on 3 possible issues he should consider whether or not to adopt a more technological approach. So 3 points, 3 marks each. And go back to the question around the quality of it, redundancies, staff morale, etc., the reliability of the technology, and even staff training, etc., that has to go in. But I'm not too worried about that. You can have a look at the suggested solution. But the key takeaways we want from this question now is there is 13 marks for calculations. There is 15 marks for narrative. Narrative is important. Bullet points are fine. But as you see in the parts G here, if there's 3 points and there's 9 marks, it's 3 marks each. So you need to give at least 2 or 3 sentences to show that you've applied your knowledge and you're thinking practically. Don't give generic answers. Apply to the facts of the case. And for the variances, this is only one way the cost variances come up. You can get material variances, or you could get a lot more detailed variances asked, because they haven't asked you Cap 1 labour variances. They haven't asked you all the planning and operating. They only asked you 2 of the 4. We've answered a lot more detail than's required, but it should give you a lot better for study purposes around advanced cost variances. So that was Autumn 19 question 1, focused on advanced cost variances, in particular the labour variances.